Hello everyone. Today I am showing you new video that is based on RBAC in Kubernetes. In previous videos I have shown you the Kubernetes deployment, rollout and replica set. Now I am showing you what is RBAC in Kubernetes. So before understanding the RBAC in Kubernetes, first understand what is RBAC. So basically RBAC is role-based access control, and that is used in Kubernetes for regulating the access to the computer and network resources and users. So basically in wider sense, RBAC is used as for regulating the access control in computer and network resources, but in Kubernetes you can say you have to control the access to the different users and different user groups. So it is a role-based access control. It regulates access to your Kubernetes cluster. It is based on individual users. You can provide different access to different individuals. It uses RBAC authorization, uses the API to drive authorization decision. So basically, you can understand in this way that the role defines what can be done to Kubernetes resources. It contains one or more rules that represent a set of permissions. And permissions are basically all the permissions are additive. There are no deny rules. You cannot deny anyone from accessing that particular namespace or resources. Just you have to provide access. So that's why it is additive. Roles are namespaced, meaning roles work within the constraint of a namespace. You can apply the roles to a particular namespace. If you have not mentioned the namespace, it is by default namespace. So basically, after creating a role, you assign it to user or group of users by creating role binding. So API objects used for RBAC is role, then cluster role, role binding, and cluster role binding. So let's understand better what is role, what is cluster role, and role binding, and what is cluster role binding. So in RBAC, role or cluster role contain the rules that represent a set of permissions. A role always sets permission within a particular namespace. When you create a role, you have to specify the namespace it belongs in. As earlier explained, I earlier told that it has to be provided for a particular namespace. And cluster role, by contrast, is a non-namespaced resource. Means roles are specified for a namespace, but cluster roles are not specified for a particular namespace. It is global available. So basically, cluster role works the same as role. There is no difference when creating the roles and cluster roles, but they are applied to the cluster as a whole. It is applied to the whole Kubernetes cluster. And cluster roles are not bound to a specific namespace. If you have 3 namespaces, it will be applicable to all the namespace. Cluster roles give access across more than one namespace or all namespace. After creating a cluster role, you assign it to user or group of users by creating role binding or cluster role binding. And basically, cluster rules are typically used with the service account. So usage of cluster roles. So cluster role basically define permissions on a namespace, resources, and be granted access within an individual namespace. Define permissions on namespace, resources, and be granted access across all namespaces. and define permissions on cluster scoped resources. So basically the cluster scoped resources are nodes, persistent volumes. Non-resource endpoints are like anything like a slash example slash help, and namespace resources are example pods across the entire cluster. Means if there are two namespace, one namespace has two pods and another has three pods, it will be applicable to all 5 pods. And there are some default cluster roles which are already available in Kubernetes cluster, that is cluster admin. This is a cluster wide super user. Then admin, full access within a namespace. Then edit, read write within a namespace. Then view, read only within a namespace. These are the basically the default cluster rules. Now understand role binding. So role binding is used for granting permission to a subject. And suppose you have created the role for a particular user, then you have to bind it with the users, a group, a service, what is there. Basically, role binding holds a list of subjects like users, groups, or service accounts, and reference to the role being granted. So there is, you have to combine. You have created a role, and you have mentioned what you role want to give. Suppose you want to give the write access or read access of particular pod or deployment. Then you have to bind with the that role with the using the role binding. And it is already explained that it is used for namespace scope. Role binding may reference any role in the same namespace. So basically, after you create a binding, you cannot change the role or cluster role. So it is applicable to both for role and cluster role. You cannot change. If you have created a binding, you have bind the role, you cannot change it. If you want to change it, you have to remove the existing and binding and then recreate a new one. Now, let's understand the cluster role binding. So, cluster role and cluster role binding function like a role and role binding, except they have wider scope. There is a difference of scope only. You have created role, you have to bind with, you have to use role binding. You have created cluster role, you have to use cluster role binding. Role binding grants permission within a specific namespace, whereas cluster role binding grants access cluster wide and to multiple namespaces. If there are, suppose you have created role X, you have to bind with the namespace Y. But if you have created cluster role Z, you can bind with, you will bind it will be globally and it will be applicable to the namespace A, B, C, D, whatever exists. Cluster role binding is binding or association a cluster role with a subject like user, group, or service account, just like a role binding. Now understand subjects. So basically the elements in RBAC definition. When you define the RBAC, what are the elements? First is subject. So subjects are nothing but a group of users, services, or team making an attempt at Kubernetes API. It defines what operations a user, service, or group can perform. Users mean these are global and mean for humans or processing living outside the cluster. Group is a set of users, and service account, especially Kubernetes uses service account to authenticate and authorize requests by pods to the Kubernetes API servers. These are namespaced and mean for intra-cluster processing running inside the pod. Another element is verbs. This is the set of operations that can be executed to the resources. are called the verbs. For example, different verbs are get, watch, create, delete. Basically, the CRUD operation: create, read, update, and delete. So these are the verbs that basically verbs is the operation. What operation have to perform. Now understand Kubernetes RBAC best practices. So there are few things you have to remember that I am explaining in my new slide. So best practices you have to follow while creating the role, a role binding, a cluster binding. First is avoid overprivileged roles. So basically it should be balanced act. You should not provide, you should given the privilege what is required. So basically it is best practice to add a new roles, adding new roles and create multiple roles, not club all the roles in one using one file, because when you have to provide some particular role to particular user, then you don't need to just do the role binding of with that particular role, not that is a common global rules. And regularly review your RBAC roles. So basically RBAC policy you need to be regularly audited. So you should remain aware of who can do what inside your cluster. It strengthen. This is basically strengthen your security, but forgotten or unnecessary role assignment can mask learning the thieves. So you have to review your roles time to time, and be careful with the wildcards. So roles let you use. Sometimes you use the wildcard for roles in their resources and work field. This can be tempting shortcut, but it makes it harder to effectively audit and maintain your policies. It also opens the possibility that users could receive automatic access to new resource added in future Kubernetes release. So make sure and be careful. Try not to use wildcard rules. So be specific to that for particular resource and verbs while creating the roles. So and another is don't forget users and service account. Authentication is important. So there is little point in using RBAC if same account is reused across multiple service and individual. Set up a dedicated service account for each integration. Then assign it to the individual roles in needs. And last one is remove unused roles. So suppose any rules is not being used, just remove it. Otherwise anyone can hack and use that particular rules in a illegal way. Now let's understand the role and role binding file. So first understand the role example. So this is the simple role example where you give the API version RBAC authorization k8s.io/v1. Kind is role. Remember this is important. Then metadata you can give the namespace default. Otherwise you can mention the namespace for which you want to provide the access, and name the pod reader. You have given its the name of this role is the pod reader. Then rules, API groups. Basically it indicates the core API group, resources, pods. So what are the for which resource you want to give the access, you have given the pods. If you want to give the access to deployment, you can write here the deployment. Then verbs. Verb means what are the operation he can using this rule it can be performed, that is get, watch and list. So this is the simple role example. Now have a look on the role binding example. So API version is same, and here kind is role binding. In the while creating the role, the kind is role. Now while creating the role binding, the kind is role binding. Then give the metadata, name, read paths, name space default, subject. So here you can define the more than one subject. So basically the kind is user and name Jane. So basically this is the Jane is the user to whom you are providing that particular role. Role ref, it specifies the binding to a role cluster role. So kind role name for reader, this must was the name of the role or cluster role you wish to bind to. And then after that, just you have to write the kubectl -f and bind your command to apply this. But before applying this, you have to apply the role. Here the user is dev, but in previous you are providing the role. Now here you are providing the cluster. There the name is secret reader. They basically the and in that, but in previous you are providing the resource to pod. Here you are providing the resource to deployment. So you have created, there are two users Jane and Dev. To Jane you are providing access you are binding with the role, and here you are binding the cluster role. You are providing access to the reading the pod, and here you are providing the access to the deployment. Next is cluster role example. Here API version will be same as it. The kind is cluster role. Here you don't have to mention the namespace because it is applicable to the globally. It will applicable to across entire cluster. And rules is API group resource secrets. So get, watch and list. Suppose some secrets resource where you have defined password etc. So for this you are providing the cluster role. This is the important thing. Here you can compare with the role. In role you have mentioned the namespace. In metadata and in cluster role you have not mentioned the namespace because namespace is not required here. Now the cluster role binding example. Let's have a look. So basically here you can see that this cluster role binding allows anyone in the manager group to read secrets in any namespace. So this is for the manager or lead. Yeah, you can bind this cluster role. So cluster role metadata is read secret global group and group name is manager. You have created in manager. So basically any user who is the part of this group, manager group, can delete the secret. So this is the example of cluster role binding example. So basically, I have shown you the how to create a so explain the roles and role binding, cluster and cluster role binding. So just to conclude, so basically we have created a role. So we have understand the role binding, cluster role and cluster role binding. You have to understand the use cases where what to use when. Use role and role binding to scope security to a single namespace. Use cluster role and role binding to scope security to several or all namespace. Use cluster role and cluster role binding to scope security to all namespace or cluster scope resources. So there are three uses. Understand? Remember, there are three cases. You can use role and role binding combination for a single namespace. Then cluster role and role binding to several or all namespace. Suppose there are 10 namespace, you can use cluster role and role binding to applicable for 7 or 5 or 6 namespaces or all 10 namespaces. And cluster role plus cluster role binding, this is applicable to all namespace or whole cluster. So when you mention the whole cluster, that means if you add 2 namespace more after some time, it will be applicable to those also. So understand, if you want to define a role within a namespace, use role. If you want to define a role cluster wise, use a cluster. This is the simple. So guys, summary is that RBAC in Kubernetes is the mechanism that enables you to configure fine-grained and specific sets of permissions that define how a given user or group of users can interact with any Kubernetes object or in the cluster or in a specific namespace of the cluster. So this is the basically the I will give you the practical example in my next video, how to with a use case, how to implement this in your cluster. So this is for this video, and please subscribe my channel and keep updated a lot of more coming videos basically on Kubernetes and latest technologies. So just this is the basically the my channel URL. Please subscribe it and keep updated with the latest videos. Thank you guys.